We want to jump right ahead into the meat of the matter. I find that for me, knowing the arts and knowing that the arts in the East does not get the same funding as primary spaces like, of course, Quebec and Toronto and other spaces, BC. I find jumping into this conversation about advocacy for the arts an interesting one and a beautiful segue. So thank you so much. Here we go. Who's talking about advocacy in the arts? Its continued importance. This is a panel discussion with in partnership with Canadian Arts Coalition, for which I have the privilege of also being on the steering committee, and I have three colleagues with me here. So basically, the panel is advocacy in the arts can be a demanding and tricky conversation, and many artists and arts organizations consider it an added challenge in a world where funding is dwindling and the need to create art is ever present. The panel is geared at discussing why advocacy is important and provide solutions and examples to how artists and arts organizations can continue to advocate for their practice. Everyone's bio will be dropped in the chat. And I'm privileged to be joined by Andrew Walker, who will be moderating this panel, and Karla, Etienne, and Barbora. I've never asked you, how do you pronounce your last name?
Racevičiūtė. We
Oh,
just go with Barbora usually.
Barbora, usually. I would have pronounced it in a very Spanish, because Spanish is my second language, way, and it would not have been right. So I'll pass it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning, everybody. It's great to join you today, and on behalf of Karla and Barbora, we're really quite honored to be invited to participate in this panel and to be with you. We have some questions and some pieces to speak through on advocacy, both from our personal perspectives and also from a broad strokes perspective across the province of Ontario and more broadly. But I want to start by just saying we really hope this is going to be a conversation with you as well. So please, at any point, don't hesitate to throw questions in the chat to jump in as makes sense, and we'll certainly leave some time at the end to have that conversation with folks, questions that they might put in the chat. Maybe to all start with introductions. I'm Andrew. I work at PAA Advisory, so we are a lobbying firm based in Ottawa, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And I've had the great honor, pleasure, a privilege, frankly, of working with the arts and culture sector in advocacy, both in Ontario and in Ottawa, so Toronto and Ottawa specifically, and in other places across the country for the last 5 or so years. I also come by this work earnestly. I work and still work as a professional singer, really all over the province, and so have a background in it that kind of drives what I get to do every day. But I also have the privilege of working with Karla and Barbora. So maybe Karla, I'll throw to you next to introduce yourself and maybe jump right into it. Why are you an advocate? Why do you advocate? What motivates you in that way?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Kwe, bonjour. Really happy to be here. Yes, I'm Karla Etienne, and I'm based in Tshitshakimunyang in Montreal. My pronouns are she, elle, and her, and I'm a dance artist, first and foremost. But since I was young, I was always advocating. And I was dancing, African contemporary-based dance in my career, and equity. It was not a thing. People said that we were not professional, that our dance was not considered to be like actual or contemporary. It was only folkloric. They say to that it was not a high art. So while I was dancing, I had to, make the case for, to be visible and that our dance would be accepted. So throughout my career, I decided to advocate. And the way that I did that was, there's many things. I was trying to do both. Be in the space, like my body was kind of political. I'm going to go on the stage and be there. You have to see me and accept my body and everything that comes with it. But I was also getting into those institutions that were closed for me, art councils, associations, and really go talk through what is equity, why our dance matter, why, European dance is not the center of the world, and go into the nitty-gritty of trying to change the things inside in. So I've been doing that since the last 25 years now. So that's who I am, and that's why I think advocacy is important, because it shifts things. And even though everything is not perfect yet, but it shifted. Equities, everybody know better what is equity. We decenter what is excellence in the art. It's not only European. We have discussion, but things are slowly shifting, and there's many ways of doing advocacy. So that's why.
Thanks,
Barbora.
Karla. Yeah, Barbora, maybe over to you. Maybe you can introduce yourself and jump into why is advocacy meaningful to you?
Yeah, hi everyone, and echoing Andrew and Karla, thank you so much for having us today. I am also in Jojage this morning, the traditional land of the Ganyan-Kahaga Nation. And I am a curator first and foremost. I'm from Lithuania originally, hence my last name. And my curatorial practice has always really centered on working with artists that don't exhibit in the traditional kind of institutions, and so are looking for other places and ways to show their artistic practice outside of the commercial market or the institutionalized market. And for me, it's been really important to recognize those artists as workers. So really, my background is in that kind of labor organizing bit of thinking of artists as workers who are producing things that are really valuable, but not necessarily in the monetary sense that we think. So that's where advocacy has started to be meaningful for me.
Thanks, Barbora. And I mean, we're 10 minutes into this conversation and nobody's mentioned the election yet, so we might as well get right into that. I think in and of itself, we've just been through, both in Ontario, frankly, and with the national government, some pretty interesting elections over the last period of time. And so I thought, as a way of opening this conversation to try and make this as tangible as we could, we might start by talking about, what we each did throughout the election, and a little bit about where we might go next. And so I think, Barbora, maybe we'll go back to you to kick us off. I know you had a strong role in the Canadian Arts Coalition's Arts Vote campaign, which was really impactful. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. And maybe I'll backtrack a little bit because I introduced myself as my individual self, which is super important in our work, but I'm also the national director of the Independent Media Arts Alliance, which represents about 100 organizations that work in independent media art, which is a complicated way of saying moving image that is not commercial, so not like big productions, so all small films and AR, VR, that kind of thing. And as part of that, I am part of the Canadian Arts Coalition and the steering committee, and I was the co-chair of the Arts Vote campaign, Arts Vote committee this past federal election. And so for Arts Vote this year, we had a very short window and we organized kind of a bunch of things. And Karla, you and Andrew, you can interrupt me if I forget things because we did a lot. Primarily, the campaign wanted to get out the vote and to make sure that people were engaged in understanding what was going on. So we had kind of some door knocking questions that people could ask to ensure that arts were accounted for in this election, and also kind of public imagery to emphasize that people across the country were supporting the arts and thinking about the arts as they were voting. And then on the other side, we also were asking people to kind of support the Canadian Arts Coalition's big advocacy ask, which is that 1% of all federal spending annually be allocated to arts and culture. So this is kind of the big piece that we're working with. And so to do that, we were also contacting all the people that were running, trying to get questions and debates, trying to get students engaged, and kind of ensure that the 850,000 people that are workers in arts and culture, we're taking account of in the federal platforms as we can. Maybe I'll leave it there and I'll let you guys jump in.
Yeah, and one of the moments for me that really struck throughout the campaign, I had the pleasure of being at a debate in Montreal hosted by the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expression. I think Karla, you were there too. And the Minister of what's his title now? Canadian Identity and Culture. Used to be Culture and Identity. Big difference that they made this time around. Anyway, he was sitting on stage, the Liberal candidate, and was asked specifically about that 1% ask in and of itself, which is something that I don't remember happening in previous elections. I don't remember happening in the Ontario campaign in the same way, for example. And it just, to me, it was kind of a neat experience to sit there and watch the work of friends and colleagues really lead to something impactful happening, where he was asked point blank, do you support the 1%, and spoke very openly about supporting investments in the Canada Council and the Department of Canadian Heritage and elsewhere. So I thought that was pretty meaningful, which I think maybe takes me, Karla, to a question for you, which is kind of, now what? We've been through an election, we've gotten through this period of time. Where do you see opportunities or challenges? Where do we go from here?
Yes, and if I may, I'm going to backtrack a bit because I think we forgot to say something very important. Who are we and why we are there? Because we represent the Canadian Coalition for the Arts. And I wanted to say that first and foremost, because the coalition is like a non-partisan group, and it's made by volunteer people that represent association or themselves. So this is like the fundamental thing about the coalition, and we work in a federal level also. So why the coalition is working is because we do a lot of consultation across Canada, trying to have united voice on different contexts, on what we're gonna advocate for. And the last starting maybe, Andrew, I don't know if it last summer or last fall, but then with consultation and agreement, we decided, okay, what can we ask that is going to be for everyone to agree with? And it's going to be a very strong message and united message for all association. We know that, and Canadians and artists, we know that there are specific needs, but this one we thought, okay, for that time, the 1%, would be important. I don't know if you remember, like, Trump was saying, like, we need to have 2% dedicated to defense. The 1%, when we compare to other countries, it was a good reach, like something that we could do. But because we are actually at 0.96% of the federal budget. So we did not go through. And talking, we said, where do we lack funding, where we could explain where we lack funding. And to reach that 1%, it was to give 140 increase to Canada, our Art Council, and 130 million increase to Heritage Canada. So since last fall, we've been working on this and gather all our strengths and our collective voice for that one message. And when we did art votes and talking to MPs, they were very struck by the fact that we were united. And I think that's what is important. So I just wanted to put that back. So the arts votes was going through continuing that message. So getting through the long term. And that's why when we had that debate in Montreal, everybody knew about that 1%, and because we did that work, and it was very important. So now the election are happening.
And maybe, Karla, I'm so sorry. Can I interrupt you just to say, just before you move on to the next piece, I think that's a really important to really hit home. My job as a lobbyist is to kind of be in constant communication with the decision makers here in Ottawa or in Toronto. And speaking about that 1% piece, what they told me, that they actually came from the deputy minister, the most senior public servant, senior permanent government official responsible for the Department of Canadian Heritage, who does a lot of the funding for the arts. And she said to us that she had never in her entire career seen such unanimity around an ask that she did last year leading into this. And that, I think, really led to the strong push within the government before the election to push forward with that 1% ask and in respect to the Canada Council and the Canadian Heritage ask. So, just to really give you a tangible example, that unanimity has an effect. having each individual organization, or frankly, individual artists across the country, or in the case of Ontario, across the province, saying the same thing over and over and over again, even if it feels like it's yelling into the void. For a person like me who has the privilege of having these conversations every day, it really makes a difference when we speak with one voice in that way, and we've seen that come true in a sense. So anyway, I just wanted to share that, and I know Karla, you wanted to take us into kind of now what.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to be short because you're going to get us to the nitty gritty. I think that's what we say in English of what we should do. But now that we have the election, we have a government that is open to the arts and culture, and we have a minister, Stephen Guilbeault, that was already a Minister of Heritage before at his first mandate. He was waited to be at the environment, but he got at Heritage. So we have someone that is returning to the case, that knows what we want for arts and culture. And actually at the debate in Montreal, it was very he knew his files. So he was very good at that. And also that I would say that he's also living for all his life in one of the most vivid neighborhood in Canada about arts and culture, and where there's a lot of concentration of arts and culture organization. So he has that relationship. So we know that our message is heard, and now that's where we have to do work. We know the context. The context is not really about art and culture. Even if they heard and they understand what it is, we have another economic context and other topics that takes the space. So we need to continue to work. So there's an opening. We have allies. We have people that we don't need to reintroduce the story about art and the importance and how it works. They know that, but we need to support them to make their own case to the budget. So Andrew, pass to you.
Yeah, and that kind of nitty-gritty process, I think, is an important piece to maybe take a second and speak to a little bit. We have a bit of a formula in some sense, and this goes for both the Ontario government and the federal government. There's a process every year, is a bit of a cycle for the development of a budget. A budget kind of acts every year as that opportunity for a government to talk about investing in whatever sectors it wishes to invest in. There are other opportunities for it to do so, but really traditionally that is the best opportunity. And we just saw last week the Ontario government announce a series of proposals, including a tourism campaign in Wasaga Beach and elsewhere that they're going to invest in as part of Budget 2025. But that budget cycle, I think, is especially when it comes to money asks, but not specifically. If we're talking about, say, employment insurance reform or the social safety net, if we're talking about other forms or other ideas we might want to put forward, whether it's individual investments or a change in a policy related to accessibility and access, whatever it may be, that's a usual one-stop shop. Each summer, both levels of government seek the opinions of stakeholders, seek our opinions about what they should include in the next budget. The federal level, there is quite literally a public consultation. Folks can submit briefs, and they can submit on behalf of an organization, they can submit on behalf of just themselves, and all of them are given equal weight. They are submitted to all of the members of Parliament who are responsible for studying the budget, the members of the Standing Committee on Finance. The Ontario government has a similar type process that happens a little later in the year, usually over the sort of December holidays, give or take. But in and around there is usually when it happens. But as a one action item, if there's one thing you can do, if there's one element to participate in from a really tangible advocacy perspective, there's one. At least as a starting point, we can submit and have our voice heard and say we are looking for this change or this investment or that investment as part of the art sector. The other piece I might engage with, and I'm looking over here just to make sure I've got it right. If I could kind of speak a little bit about advocacy as a craft, if I could put it that way. It's a bit of an art form in a sense, advocacy, because there isn't a one way to do it. There are kind of preconditions for success. And so if we try to get into the nitty gritty of where do we go from here, it boils down to sort of 5 steps, if I could put it that way, in order to have success in advocacy. The first one is a defined and urgent ask. And so whatever our ask is, we have to make sure that it's defined. So supporting the social safety net is an example of an ask that isn't clear for a government official to understand what exactly do you want me to do, but an increase to the eligibility for employment insurance is a more defined ask. An investment of 140 million to the Canada Council for the Arts is a more defined ask, as opposed to invest in the arts and culture sector. But that defined and also urgent ask is what's really important. The people in Ottawa and in Toronto, government decision makers, and frankly, not just in those places, don't make decisions necessarily because it's good policy, but because it has to happen now. There are so many competing asks on a given government that it's really important to have something that is urgent. This investment will mean something now. This will cause this or that to happen, some reason why it's defined and urgent. So that's number one. Number two, a rhetoric that matches the priorities of decision makers. So why are we asking for this? What is our argument for the ask? And why does that argument match what the person across from me cares about? This is why the art sector is brilliant in that we can interact, unlike some sectors, with any political party. Any person that sits across from us will have a way we can connect with them on arts culture, what the meaning of investing in the arts can be, investing in individual artists, investing in individual jobs, investing in individual businesses, and investing in our identity and our culture and the equity and access to our identity and our culture, the building of what we are together. Anyway, the rhetoric is what's important. How do we meet the person across from us where they are? Third one, political champion. We need to identify someone who's going to champion our ask. So in the case of the Canada Council ask, the 1%, Canada Council and Canadian Heritage, we have someone who has very clearly said, Minister Guilbeault, I am going to represent this ask where I am going to move forward and push hard for investments to both the Canada Council and the Department of Canadian Heritage. But that person internal to the government is important, a political champion. The fourth step is a chorus of voices, folks that we can build together, whether that's from the sector or from in government. How can we have every conversation with my local MP in Hamilton or in Thunder Bay or in Sudbury? How do I have those folks stand up and voice their support for the ask as well? And then finally, an opportunity for action. How physically does the government move forward in and of itself to affect change? They can only affect change in an investment so many times per year. And so right now, for example, the Ontario government has just had their budget. If we ask them, we need you by June 1st to invest money into the Ontario Arts Council, there's no meaningful path. There's no opportunity for action. Whereas if we see it from the angle, from the lens that there's a little bit more time to spend on this, into the fall, for example, there is absolutely an opportunity there. And that's, I think, where there are pieces to build. So all of that is a bit of a word vomit at you, but it's trying to give you a little bit of some tangible tools about where we can go and when our opportunities are. Literally, what can we do next? It kind of takes me into, we've talked in this sort of theoretical level. We might want to also talk about what has success looked like. And I think that also is a helpful component to this conversation because success doesn't always mean the same thing. Maybe I'll start with you, Barbora. I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but can you talk a little bit about a success in advocacy you've seen to this point? What's the secret sauce in your experience to get to that successful point?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Andrew. I want to talk about what I would consider like a half success, because we're talking about advocacy in, there is the money bit, the getting finances, securing financial resources for arts and culture. And then there is the policy issues. I think this conference is a lot about equity and kind of changing structures, working within them. So for IMA, which is the acronym of my organization, there was a really, really small fund at Canada Council just for media artists to get equipment. And for them, it was not a lot of money, but on our side, it really did account for a lot. And they decided to sunset it for whatever reason. And obviously, my members and the community at large was really, really upset about this and wanted me on behalf of them to go to Canada Council and kind of say that this was a bad choice that they made, which I did. But as we know, kind of talking to people in positions of bureaucracy and of power, it can be the decisions are made in complex ways from their point of view, and they're pretty solid. And so for me to say, everyone is upset about this kind of got me so far. And they were willing to engage in discussion. and to think through it, but it was kind of like a long-term drawn out process. And then at the same time as I was doing this, Canada Council was touring the country and meeting with artists and meeting with arts communities in different regions in Ontario, in the East, et cetera, et cetera. And IMA made sure that all our members went to those meetings and spoke loudly on the impact of that fund, not just on them and their centers, but let's say they got money to get a projector. That projector, the dance organizations in their communities were also using, the arts educators were also using. And so here, for Canada Council to hear from across the country how many people were actually impacted by this really small fund in their eyes, ultimately made them change their mind, and they reinstituted the fund, which that bit, super successful. We're really, really thrilled. But I do want to kind of give that caveat because I think it's important in how I think about advocacy. The fund was reinstituted in the same way as it existed before. The same organizations are getting it at the same amounts, and there's no room for new people coming into the field, for people who haven't gotten it based on structural inequities in the past. And so we're really finding ourselves as the same or older, usually wider organizations are getting this money in the same way. And the work to now push for the next round of advocacy to be like, the way that this fund is administered also needs to change in order to ensure that the funds are distributed the way that the community actually needs to thrive, is ongoing work that is in some ways a lot harder than getting the money in and of itself back. Yeah.
Could we pull that thread? I mean, what a success in and of itself, Barbora, but why is that the harder part? And kind of how do you face that in and of itself?
Yeah, I think that's the harder part because it's about changing attitudes. It's about changing policy. It's about telling the story in a way that isn't quantifiable, that is not shown in the same way. You can get the data, but at the end of the day, it is a value question. Wanting to change the structure is difficult, or changing it is difficult. Wanting to, I think, is quite simple. But kind of keeping your finger on the pulse at every turn to say, sure, this is great, and yet, right, not taking the win for the win, it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of commitment from everyone involved, which I think for some, and yeah, I can be frank, like in the IMA membership, getting the money in and of itself, that's good enough. And having that kind of clarity of vision for all our community to ensure that those who have not been advantaged by this funding in the past are, because that's actually a thriving sector. It's kind of continuous outside of the individual moment of a win. And I think that's what I mean by it's harder.
Yeah, and the word that's coming to my mind anyway is resilience. Like there is a tremendous amount of resilience to go in, and we can see the win along the way, but often it's sort of that half win. If there was absolutely a win, there is money now continuing to be available for some organizations, and that's a good thing. However, the big picture is a long-term game. It's a long-term effort and requires a lot of that resilience to keep going. And so, no, I really appreciate that. Karla, maybe over to you. Can you talk to us about a successful advocacy period? And I think resilience might also come up in your piece too.
Of course, resilience is gonna come up, and thank you, Barbora, for that example, because it shows the length of the work and the step-by-step length of the work that we have to continue building and reaffirming our values and why we're doing it. The experience, and Kevin, you know a lot about it. It was about the Resilient Fund that some organization was able to get during the pandemic, and what was the Resilient Fund at that time? So during the pandemic, everybody remember that traumatic event. Everything shut down. We couldn't do any shows. We can go in the studio, rehearse. We can do anything, and the government very fast did like the salary, input. If you were salaried, you could get some money to pay your salaries. But most of the artists, like 50%, 52% of artists are not on salary, right? They are independent artists. So the coalition with other organizations was, as you pointed, Andrew, said the art sector is really, really in crisis, and artists they have no way to, to be able to pay their bills, because even if they work at restaurants or teaching, everything that they used to do is closed down. So we were very, very good to say, like, we are in crisis and it's not sustainable and we don't know how it was going to go. And that's how, at that time, Heritage Canada decided to do two things: to do that big fund for that they called Resilient Fund, to give direct money to independent artists, $1,200 shot, and give a lot of money for training. If artists that they don't have the time to, they cannot work, we can do a lot of training during that time around mental health and other competencies. So Canadian Dance Assembly, what I work for, we applied because we need to apply to get that fund. And the way that we did it, we partnered with how do you say, ASOS, arts organization. Yeah, arts service organization across Canada. We had 27 partners that came behind us to write that grant, that CDA was having the capacity to do that. Our budget, I'm going to say, is under $300,000, but we had, first of all, 3.88 million. And then we did it so good that we ended up with 5.2 million to give to artists, 2,500, and to serve almost 2,000 dancers with $2,500 at that time. And I know CDA really focused on equity and wanted to raise the level also, like about transparency, saying who gets the money in which provinces, because we knew for sure Ontario and BC artists would get that money more easily. They have more relationship with CDA. So how we could do work to make sure, and our partners were key to make sure that people that really needed the money get through the money. So for me, it was a very powerful moment, but we know the pandemic was specific. And when you talk about resilience, is also suddenly the government understand that 2,500 was a good amount to help you for a month. So when we go about, like minimal wage or employment insurance, that level and the employment insurance is not the same level. And how could we build on what happened for the Resilient Fund? Like knowing is that you needed that amount to survive, to be able to, to pay your basic funds. You are a worker. You need that money. It's not because we think you're just doing nothing in your studio. We believed in that. But to continue with the rhetoric and say, well, you thought about that level. Why is it that artists are not capable to access that easy the employment insurance? Why is it that the level of insurance is very low, and it just puts you on a like scarcity mode for you to think to work? And at that time they had the values and they had the understanding. So for me it's a good way to see how we can raise and continue the work about our values and how to work it. And if I can give another example, Andrew, can I do that? That is, we didn't see the result yet, but something that I found it very important is the campaign letter that we did the last fall for the 1%. CDA really tried to engage with artists for them to write letters to MPs, through the MPs, and to say, like, you listen, if you want my vote, this is what I think is very important. And to do really more grounded work, like not only me talking to MPs, but our members to talk to their MPs and their constituents to talk to MPs. It was very hard to do. I think we had the most successful campaign, but to my point of view, it was too small. Way too small. Even if maybe 60 letters went out, but across Canada, for me, it's really too small. So I think it's a challenge to make sure that it's not about like, oh, I'm doing advocacy and I'm in my office and I'm going to talk to the MPs. I'm so important. It's not about that. It's like every MPs and every people that do the politics understand from lived experience why art is important. And I think it was kind of successful because people understood, it made it a bit visible what is the advocacy work. But at the same time, we should have done or built more relationship with our members and artists that they get to like what it is and why it's useful. And I know there's cynicism around, politics and everything, but how you can change something if you have a pre-written letter, but you send it to the MP or you engage with them. So this is the example I wanted to share.
Thank you, Karla. And I'm actually going to go off script. Give me 2 seconds here because I'm going to bring you this box
Yes.
that I have in my office here of, I think it's something like 9,000 letters that somebody sent in a campaign once. But just to give you all a sense, I mean, I was in a series of meetings once. This was for the Canada Music Fund. And folks that we worked with were able to, as you just said, Karla, bring in, a standard letter for folks to send. And they quite literally, I mean, printed copies out and we walked them all around Ottawa and they'd take each meeting and they'd start by just taking them out of the box, putting them onto the table, one after the other, so you could barely see the face of the person, by the end of it, sort of thing. The point being, it's kind of silly, as I lift these things out of the way, it's kind of silly, but in and of itself was an example of, just how much that kind of letter writing campaign can have an impact, that kind of presence. And, the number of letters absolutely matters, but also it's the engagement, it's the active participation. And I think that's exactly what you pointed out there, Karla. I see, Barbora, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I do, because I just saw Kevin's question about how do artists build the confidence and the know-it-all to do the advocacy that you speak about. And I'm going to push back on Kevin's premise to say there is no know-it-all. Like advocacy, like I think it's like a definition thing of like we think of what Andrew does, talking to politicians as advocacy, but really where it starts is in getting used to, in every conversation that we're in with our barista, with all our community, to be saying, this is what I do, this is the role that arts plays in your community. That is advocacy. Speaking about the importance of the arts at every moment that you have an opportunity to do so publicly, that's advocacy. Writing a letter to your MP is advocacy. And not even necessarily writing, going to a town hall, kind of participating in communal events where you can have a place to speak about your work. That's advocacy. And it starts there. And then, and that's how confidence is built, of like, our confidence is built. My confidence is built daily talking about this to all of you. And then I have to go and talk to a person in a position of more power. And it's just that. And I'll let, Karla take it.
No, I was just saying, like, together, Barbora and I, like last fall, we were supposed to talk to MPs and different MPs. We were with together. Okay, let's prepare. Okay, you say this, I say this, and oh my God, this worked, but this didn't work, didn't fall well. So every time we needed to readjust our arguments and which examples, it was like a lived experience of learning how to do that. I don't have an education. Yes, I do have a bit of education because with Andrew and from OCAD, but it's really by talking it through, and there's no really false step, I would say, like to be afraid of, because you talk to another person and they do their job and you do your job, and how you can have that conversation and engagement. I think it's where the magic happens. They might not be, on the same page, or they might ask you a hard question. But I find when the hard question is going through, I think we had that with Barbora, okay, I'm going to push through and understand even more, you know, why I want to do that, why it's important, and be very authentic about it. Show as you are. And I think the connection works, and you can have a real like dialogue.
I think there's something to be said for, I used to work for a couple of members of parliament, and we kind of forget that these folks are also just people. Often, almost always, 99% of the time, people that just care about their communities. And not just, they truly care about their communities, regardless of the political stripe. It's so easy, as Karla said a minute ago, to have the cynicism of our world feed into us when we talk about politics. But for most, not all, but almost all, most folks in politics, they're just trying to make a difference, and they're trying to make their communities a little bit better. I used to work for a conservative member of parliament for a period of time from the outskirts of Calgary and then into Banff. And when I was working for him, the one thing that he wanted to focus on was ensuring that folks who had recently had a baby who passed away very early on in its life, in the first couple of weeks, according to the employment insurance system, wouldn't get leave, wouldn't get parental leave because they're no longer eligible. How heartless a system could that be, to have someone who's just lost their child now no longer be able to have the coverage or the support of the government of Canada system by no fault of their own, having been through all of that. And so he spent his time focusing. He had a constituent tell him that story, and he spent his time, he did all he could within government. He wasn't in government, he was an opposition member, but he passed a motion in the House. He brought it up a committee. He brought petitions forward. He spent a lot of his time focusing on, how do I make some change on this issue? This isn't a person that's a doctor. It's not a person that's a public policy expert. I mean, Blake was a real estate guy from Airdrie, Alberta, and took this on as a way that he can make his community that little bit better. And so, when we talk about lobbying or advocacy, when we talk about engaging, it's exactly as Barbora said. I think about just having conversations from one person to another, meeting folks where they are. And the piece I'd add on top of that, the best way to build confidence is to start. It's just to take the first step. Whatever opportunity, whatever that means for you in your situation, if it's participating and signing an online petition, if it's going to a town hall, if it's at your local farmers market where you see the local member of provincial parliament's banner up and talking to somebody that volunteers for them, if it's getting involved with the art service organization, with CPAMO or anyone else, I think those are all steps you could take, but really it's about starting. Finding an opportunity to start somewhere. I think the last sort of successful advocacy story I might segue us into, just to mention, I think might bring us to some of what our concluding remarks might get to too, which is around building coalition. And there's the capital C coalition, the Canadian Arts Coalition, and other pieces, and that's wonderful. But a lot of the time it is about finding common voice and finding something that brings us all together as we try to move an issue forward. I had the privilege of working with 17 organizations, performing arts organizations specifically, from across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta over the last year and a half or so. And they started by making the very clear argument, based in data, that there's historical inequity in funding for folks in that part of the country and other parts of the country too, but for folks in the prairies. And that was what they wanted to start with. That was their ask. That was what sort of brought them together. And these were organizations that worked in theater and in dance and in opera and music. And all of these folks, regardless of their different sort of perspectives and individual needs, came together to say, hey, we are in a crisis moment, and specifically to our region, this is the sort of problem we've identified. But they also came together around how do we solve this, a sort of ask about where we go next. And so that meant, making perhaps a creative ask, speaking, the Canada Council is a long-term game, something we can talk to in the medium term about, the next time the granting cycles come up. But in the meantime, we can think creatively about where in government there might be an opportunity to fill in the gaps, to invest in our organizations, about where we can go from here, to invest in our artists and the creative professionals around our community, to say, hey, we need to rebuild audiences, rebuild a capacity to bring folks back into our halls, but also to encourage folks to make the investments that they can, to encourage philanthropy, to participate online, whatever it may be. And those 16, 17 organizations had meeting after meeting after meeting together, but also individually. They spoke with their local members of parliament. They spoke with people in their community, be they supporters or board members or fellow artists or other folks that they knew who might know someone. They were doing that constant advocacy work, as Barbora described, of not just taking the meetings, although they took the meetings too, but also having the conversation constantly with folks in their community to say, hey, this is what we're pushing for. This is what will make a difference. This is why it has to happen right now. And they were successful. They received, there was an investment into the Prairies Economic Development, or Prairies Can, of $20 million. What an incredible thing for the performing arts in the Prairies. You know, as I'm just sort of rehashing a little bit of Barbora's points here too, in that you know, there's never a dull moment in this process. The actual implementation of getting the money out the door and figuring how to design the programs and who has access and who doesn't have access, and is it an equitable process? Really, really important questions that I think everyone who participated in this process would say were not done perfectly, and there are a lot of lessons to be taken from how it has happened. But at the end of the day, you know, organizations received an investment into building their runway for viability back, to making sure that there is going to be, you know, a theater company or a dance company or a symphony orchestra or an opera company in Regina or Winnipeg or in Saskatoon. So, you know, I think there's some beauty to that. But it all boils back down to a couple of those key tenets. Like, you know, I'm trying to make this more tangible. What makes the difference? How does this work for us? It's about having an ask that everyone can get behind, and then having that constant conversation with folks by matching whatever their priorities are. In this case, the government of Canada was focused on downtown revitalization. We got to bring people back to the downtown core so that it feels safe, so that we have the bustling communities that we want. And how do we do that? We invest in the arts. That folks come into the downtown and they come for dinner and they take public transit and they participate in the broader community when they come to see a show. That was the narrative of the day. That's what the government cared about. So even though we can make arguments about how regional inequity in funding, it's been a historical issue, we didn't talk about that much. Even though that's the reason we started, that's not the rhetoric of the day. The rhetoric of the day was, hey, listen, people come downtown when the Jets game and when the Royal Manitoba Theatre Company's going and when the Winnipeg Symphony's going and several others. That's the fundamental piece that I think folks were able to make an ask for over and over again, matching that rhetoric for where government folks are. So regardless, and I see a couple of comments in the chat too, you know, regardless of where you know, where you situate, where your organization or your artistic practice or what that means for you can be situated, it's also really important to match that dialogue with the folks who are going to make the decision that can support you know, the ask that you're trying to make and meet them where they are. Yeah, Barbora, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in to say, like, you know, and I've struck, and maybe I'm just gonna talk from my experience. Like when Andrew says this, I have been in the past kind of struggling to be like, okay, well, how do I do this without compromising my values or the values of my organization, right? And I think that the way that I've kind of found a path through is we just have to be creative and imaginative in how we craft our arguments. And we all have all of us artists have the power to do this. So it's not so much like when saying they have to match the issue of the government, it's not that you have to agree with the issue fully, but you have to find an angle and a way to get what you're interested in to resonate to them and what they're talking about. And I think I just wanted to say that because I think sometimes it does create friction, at least in my mind. And actually, it's an opportunity to think outside the box.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, but it's a really helpful point. I mean, like just to speak blatantly, I don't know how many presentations I've given over the last year preparing for what was likely going to be a you know, strongly right-wing conservative government in Ottawa, a change that we were going to have here. And perhaps, I mean, I don't know, we didn't have the government elected, but perhaps a change that wouldn't have meant more investment in the arts, would have meant some hard times for arts and especially equity deserving groups as part of the arts community. That was something we were fearful of. And you know, I don't know whether that would have come to fruition or not, but we talked about, okay, how do we make our asks relevant to those folks too? Because they absolutely are. Again, that same story I was telling a minute ago, those folks are just trying to make their communities better, and that includes you and all of us. We are part of those communities. So they're earnestly trying to do those things, and they have perhaps different perspectives. We all have different perspectives on how to go about doing so. But you know, what's an opportunity to meet those folks where they are? It's to talk about, you know, the fact that artists are workers. At the end of the day, we share the same premise of, look, I just want to be able to put food on my table and pay my rent, and maybe participate in a cultural activity, and be able to afford participating in a cultural activity in some way, be able to have access to participating in a cultural activity. I'm a worker just like you are, just like your neighbor is. I am your neighbor. Those arguments, I think, fundamentally are not necessarily a partisan issue, but it's a way to sort of speak in the same way that, in this case, the Conservative Party of Canada was and is speaking now. Similarly with a Liberal Party or New Democrats or Ontario Progressive Conservative or whoever it may be. Each party, each person has their own way of approaching the issue, but we can speak about ourselves in a way that brings our artistic practice, brings just who we are, and as artists, as neighbors, as community members, down to the really basic, so that we can relate on a similar level to what they care about.
Thank you both for talking about that. I think it was very important. Just before the election for me I have to share, it was very, very hard. I was just like, if you want to hear the real story, Kevin, it was just like, what am I doing? Should I actually stop this conversation and go in the streets? Like, my heart was in the streets. It was not going to talk to whatever chance that other party would win. And I thought, with my face and my pronouns, they didn't want to talk to me anyway, so I should go in the streets. But at the same time, I was like, okay, but I gain a bit of knowledge. Do I better serve my community having those hard conversations? Should I do that? And finally, I stepped in, like, there's, as I said in the beginning, there's this different ways of doing advocacy. I think there's protest. I can be in the protest, and I can also be inside and having those hard conversations. But it was tearing up my heart. It was really not easy. And I was like, what are we doing? Why we're doing that work? Where is our place where you feel like the world is actually, falling apart? I'm going to say, like, there's very harsh thing happening right now. So having conversation, is that a thing now? Is that a thing? Having conversation. It was difficult. And we were lucky, I find, to have another slightly different context, but not to forget that it's still there. And how we're going to engage, and why it's still important that we have those conversations. It's a question that I need to ask myself all the time. And I think that we all collectively need to ask ourselves all the time. It's not we had this, recall, you were there last week, a very important conversation. What is my job and what is my work? And I'm not there for my job. My job it's not the pay. I'm like, which work I want to do, why it makes sense for me to be there, and how can I make a difference, even if it's slight, but to actually move forward the values that I believe in for that society. Even it's very difficult, it's shadow work. And sometimes I go in my bed and I'm like, am I doing the right thing? Or how also my community is looking at me, like, Afro-descendant woman, what are you doing there? Do you talk for us? What are you pushing? Do you push enough for us? Like, what do you do? So I think this thing is part of also of the work that we do. Unless yes.
Yeah, and being able to sleep at night, I think, is also like an important piece to talk about here, and maybe links into a question that Kevin put in the chat a little bit about crafting what we're saying based off of what resonates to us and to our community. Making sure that we're being earnest and honest with ourselves about what we're doing and how we're saying it and how we're pushing it. Maybe a question for either one of you, and then I can jump into, have you gotten pushback in your work from maybe your members or other folks in your communities about pushing or talking about arts and arts advocacy through the lens of the economy, and making an economic argument for why government should take action to support our sector? Barbora, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely get pushback every day from the IMA membership, from some IMA members. Some IMA members who hold the belief that all the money in the world will not change the broken structures, the inequitable structures within which we work. And I don't disagree with that. But kind of to Karla's point of like, where is the work and where can we have impact? I do think, and this is my position as the head of an art service organization, that we have to be doing both things at once. Not asking for the financial resources that we need to pay people who work in our sector isn't a solution. But at the same time, we have to be doing the work of pushing back towards the inequities, the white supremacy, the, you know, extractive capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on, as part of that ask, and not lose sight of that when we're asking for money. Because I think that something that happens that I alluded to earlier is that win is sweet. It's intoxicating. And there is a draw to just kind of resting on your laurels and relaxing after that. And that is where they get you. To me, that is where you get caught in no longer pushing for the values that you actually will believe in, that those financial resources are supposed to be for. So that's how I navigate that question.
Thank you, Barbora. For me, I also do this both work. You know, CD is not only about advocacy. We do the advocacy, and we know. And thank you for you, Andrew, and your team to always pave to work about in which context we are in and what strategy we should go to make that some gains. You know, I think it's very important. But at the same time, we try to continue the base work about working about equity, everything that we need to do. So people see like CDA, okay, they ask for that money, they do that work, but they do the groundwork at the same time. So I think it's helping balancing, and you know, artists felt like economy was, you know, something that was deeply felt like this time. You know, everybody was like, I'm not getting my grants. Like, it's a fact. Like, I have a basic tour, a super tour, I'm not touring. Or I was supposed to have access to the touring program, I still don't have access. Or, so the economics of it felt like a bit more like, okay, I feel it every day. But what Kevin brought also, that it was difficult to change and navigate the argument, is about the impact to society and citizen, you know. And I think we were supposed to get there, Andrew. I'm moving forward a bit about why also it's important that we have the relationship with artists, because especially in this group, like the community work that we do is the way that we do art. We don't do art for itself. It's about community, it's about healing, it's about engaging ourselves, it's about mental health, it's about like building, you know, neighborhoods that thrives. That's why we do art. And this thing, we need to say it more, but because artists do that work, I think that value needs to come up. You know, it's not advocacy, it's not a top down, it's a come up. And when we were together and we were talking to MPs, yeah, I can say that they were like reacting to the data. We're 850,000 workers. But when each one, we had a story, an impact story on citizen, they art melt. They were like, oh my God, yes, this is important. I remember suddenly I bring my daughter to the theater. She's so good in theater and she does this. And I was so proud. And they just forget about how we cannot live without art in this world. We can't. We can't not. It's just like even in war and everything, people still continue to do art as a resistance to their humanity. And this artist, that's their role, to make that up, you know, go through and raise that voice.
Gosh, I don't know how I follow that, Karla. That I couldn't agree more with everything you've just said. But I think that's a really helpful kind of maybe, you know, message that we can leave each other with. Barbora, not to put you on the spot to do that work, but is there a parting message, something that you would want to share to kind of build on what Karla shared?
I honestly, no. I think Karla's words really kind of, all I could say is a platitude compared to that. Like, yeah, art matters every day, all the time, and artists matter. And yeah.
Yeah, and so maybe by way of conclusion, you know, I think if I could, you know, add on to all of this, it is about taking action and starting somewhere. And I think there's a real power. We've tried to speak a little bit today about some of the specific examples of when we see that success. We've talked about some of the specific challenges. We've talked about, even some of the theory behind why and how we do this work. But I'm a jaded lobbyist, so you can take everything I say for the grain of salt that it deserves. But at the end of the day, folks in Ottawa, in Toronto, and in other places where decision makers are making decisions about where to invest and how to build up our sector and our community from a public policy perspective, it does start with getting involved, about saying something, about participating in whatever way that works for you. And there really isn't a wrong way to participate. There is no step that is too small in and of itself. By speaking to anyone in your community, to raising the question of what can we do, is in and of itself advocating, and it is being part of the sector. And where we can find common cause and where we can build a shared message about why this matters, those are the moments when we see success. Those are the moments when we see actual change starting to take place, is when we do it together. And so being part of this panel today, being an attendee at this conference is an act of advocacy. You are already doing the work. I'm preaching to the literal choir as we speak. And so I think, as we think about where we go from here, it's to continue to do this work and to not let, whatever fears or apprehensions or whatever else get in the way of taking the small or big step that you can to be an advocate for our sector in the arts world. So there's my soapbox. I wanted to take some time. I think we're coming close to the time allotted, and to see if there were any questions that folks had from the audience, or any other sort of thoughts or reflections before we handed it off.
I wonder if we can begin the conversation part of it with that contribution of the arts to the Canadian GDP, and how it's more than fisheries or agriculture. And because I don't think a lot of artists and arts organization are aware of the impact of the arts to the Canadian GDP in that particular way. Do you mind, Andrew, just giving a brief synopsis of that enormity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said it well, Kevin. The arts and culture sector by data has, as Karla said, 850,000 workers across the country that are directly involved in the arts work. For every dollar that the Canada Council spends on art in Canada, it gets $5.75 back, almost $6 in a return on investment. We are a larger sector of the Canadian economy than the forestry business, than the mining business, the natural resources, with the exception of oil and gas. We are really, from an economic perspective, we have a really strong story to tell. Just doesn't feel like it sometimes. It's one of those pieces where we can feel as though we're working within our communities and have that space that we take up, but there is a bigger story to tell too, from a public policy perspective of investing. We're the only sector really that has a funding body that operates in the way that it does across the Canadian economy. There are massive investments, for better or for worse, in the auto manufacturing sector, and in the mining sector, the oil and gas sector, ones that are coming to mind, in the technology sector, frankly. There are massive investments that go there, but there isn't a standing body like the Ontario Arts Council or the Canada Council for the Arts that is there to make investments constantly, to have those operational investments. And so it means within government, there's a little bit of a segmenting of our world. We're not part of the Minister of Industry. We're part of the Minister of Canadian Heritage, or Canadian Identity and Culture. And isn't that interesting? Why aren't we in industry? If we're larger than so many other industries, why don't we have that portfolio? And there are ministers of agriculture and fisheries and oceans and all the rest of it too. But there's an interesting dynamic to that about what it means for how our sector is considered. I try, depending on the audience, when I speak with government, I try to say industry rather than sector, the arts and culture industry, which is a small change in language, but I think it's trying to hit home that we are meaningful when they think about their financial estimates each year, about where the budget of Canada is, in a way that goes above and beyond. We are that and more, and that's the beauty of where we can tell the stories and say you as a Canadian government are investing in a sector that drives jobs and GDP and a meaningful investment in our economy, and also make sure that we feel who we are, that helps build a contribution to community and downtown revitalization, making our cities feel like cities, making our communities feel like communities, and having that shared experience that I got asked recently. how do I define Canadian identity? And I mean, I don't know, what a question. But I started by talking about, at the end of the day, to me, it's about shared experience. There isn't like a Tim Hortons is not Canadian identity. There is no some sort of like idea of having healthcare is not in and of itself a shared identity. It's not, in my opinion, Canadian identity. It's about the fact that we together share in that experience, for better or for worse. And so, for what it's worth, when we make the economic arguments, we get to make the argument above and beyond that. But I think it's important to have that economic argument because it really is so impactful. Anyway, I'm now just ranting, but that's
It's a
hopefully
good
that answers a
rant.
little bit of your question, Kevin.
I think there is the advocacy you're doing right now around us adopting industry rather than sector. I see here, if you don't mind, just briefly, there's two things that I want to bring in Karla to probably clarify what possible advocacy can be done for a comment in the chat later. But Andrew, there's a question here about defining. I put in the chat, yes, for arts industry, not sector. And one of the attendees is asking to define the difference. Do you mind from your perspective, why industry rather than sector?
We talk about industry within the public policy landscape as something that has a direct impact on GDP, on the economic performance of the country. Whereas we talk about a sector from like a stakeholder management piece of like, this is a sector of people that we need to be aware of because they have concerns. Whereas this is an industry that drives where we go. This is an industry that drives our economy. So it's not that the words themselves intrinsically are wrong or right. It's about connotation within the sort of Ottawa bubble or the Queen's Park bubble or wherever else. But when we say industry, I find there's an implication to that implies we are a strong element of what our economic performance as a province or as a country are. Whereas we talk about sector, it's more of there's a sector that's over there. That's kind of something that's not part of the industry. It's something that's over there that needs to be managed, that has opinions and is its own thing. Whereas if we're part of the industry, we're an industry, then we are akin to auto manufacturing or forestry or whatever else, as part of those economic conversations.
Thank you so much for that. Karla, yes, Karla.
Yeah, can I offer also something that I find is a pushback against like the idea of artists, just alone in their house or their studio getting inspiration and ask money for it, because they're genius. And working to say like we're industry, like it's not like we like to work with our friends, right? We hire people. There's to have a show. People don't know that we need a full team, and we just like give employments, and it's just like we're actually working and building an ecosystem of workers. And I think that's not, people don't exactly know how we end up on the stage, all the work that needs to be done and how many people are hired for that work to exist. And for me, it talks more to industry. People, they see a car, they understand that a lot of people work behind a car, but they don't understand that a lot of people work behind a show.
Yes, I think you're also hinting at the point about shifting values as it relates to the arts industry and the work that we do and the impact of the work that we do. That's, as again Barbora has mentioned, that's both quantitative and qualitative. And so I love the conversation because it enlivens the participants, the artists, the attendees to begin to think through those particular pieces, as you've mentioned, in diversely talking about the work that they do. Karla, there's a comment here about burlesque performance and advocacy. Could you speak to, from your expertise, what could this particular attendee do to encourage, let's say, someone at the OAC to begin to think about burlesque dance as an art form?
But I think Christine said that she did it. She said she was good and she did that advocacy and it's done. Am I understanding it wrong?
I see. If I can. Christine, do you want to come into the conversation? I did. Oh, you did. Okay, well then I
But
it's a
maybe
self-reflexive comment.
I think maybe Christine could share in that
Yeah, Christine,
conversation.
if you want to come in to share.
Yes.
Sure. Hi, guys. Years ago, I met up with the dance officer for OAC. I took him to coffee and explained to him that burlesque is a dance form. And therefore, if it is a dance form, then they should be able to apply for a grant. Year later, one of the burlesque performers from the Toronto Burlesque and Vaudeville Alliance, of which I am a member, got a grant. So it's not, doing simple advocacy like that is actually not that hard. You just have to find the bodies and explain to them what needs to be done. And if it's not work for them, all they have to do is fill out a form, you know, it's not that big a deal. And the arts, there is the Burlesque Festival has been getting grants since then for years. So it's something, you know, it's just a case of you just have to find the right bodies and explain to them what, you know, how it can work. You know, it's a case of changing the language, I would say. You know, I think I started the conversation by talking about belly dance. He understood belly dance, so it was just a case of going from belly dance to burlesque, and that he could make the understanding from there.
Thank you, Christine.
Not a problem, Karla.
If I can mirror something when we say advocacy is at different level, Kevin, before we close the call. When I was dancing and I was doing advocacy at my association, I was a member of RQD, Regroupement Québécois de la Danse. And at that time, the program for training for dancers, you had to take first, they would say like universal base training for everyone, where you get your money was ballet. And alternative training was Pilates, Feldenkrais, African dance, circus, whatever it was. And I had to say to them for a year, I remember, you know, ballet might be my alternative training. I never trained in ballet. It's not a universal thing that ballet is training for everyone, that it's a basic thing. And then I had to, you know, advocate that they change their reimbursement for training for dancers, that you have to train in your form in the beginning and whatever alternative was. But I really had to fight to explain over again that ballet was not at the center training for everyone. And this is not to government, it's to my own association. But it was like if I'm a decent artist and I have access to fund for training that government gives you, it's public funding. I'm a citizen, I need that money as you deserve. So I'm sorry about the ballet, but you're gonna help me support training for me to be an excellent dancer too. That's another example, Kevin.
Yes, and thank you for that. You have a problem with ballet? I'm being sarcastic, of course. Knowing you so well.
Another discussion, but you can love ballet. I won't get you a problem with it.
I think to end it with this idea around also then how advocacy helps to support dismantling those historical inequities around perception and value to a particular training and form is so beautiful. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to end the conversation, and thank you all for being here and for enlivening the first day with such an interesting and important conversation.
Well, maybe I'll just conclude by thanking you all. Thank you, Kevin, and the organizers for having us. And you know, I think I speak on behalf of both Karla and Barbora when I say it really is a privilege, as we said off the top, to be with you today to talk about this work. We'd love to keep, you know, this conversation going with the whole sector, with the whole industry. Let me get that right. With everyone who's involved in our arts and culture ecosystem, in whatever way that means. And I think it's together that we are able to keep this work moving forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for having us. And anyway, anytime that we can help, we're happy to chat.